Education should develop memorization skills. Timetables should be learned by heart. True or false?
I'm not a big fan of true or false, by the way. So let me answer it this way. Developing and maintaining memory capacity will always be an important part of education, especially when you think about it in terms of a lifelong experience.
Social media ban for kids is the right thing to be done. True or false?
Hey, when has banning anything ever solved the problem?
Artificial intelligence might destroy the education system as we know it. True or false?
I prefer disrupt rather than destroy.
Welcome to the 45th episode of the Skills Factory. And let me introduce our guest speaker for this episode, Khalid El-Mital, Rector of the United World College of the Adriatic. Welcome, Khalid.
Thank you, Maria. Hi. First of all, let me say a huge thank you for inviting me on your podcast. I'm a big fan of the European Training Foundation. And I'd also like to say that I'm incredibly proud of the fact that the current director of the ETF, Dr. Pilvitosti, is an alumna of the United World College of the Adriatic in Duino. And if my memory serves me correctly, one of the previous directors of the organization, Dr. Cesare Onestini, was also an Adriatic alumnus. So it seems that we are managing to provide you with directors. So I feel that
you are the factory. You're the factory of ETF directors, indeed. So maybe one of your current pupils is the next one.
Who knows? The only thing I will say that if that is the case, be nice to our students.
Excellent. So Khalid, you are not only the rector of the United World College, but also you've been teaching for several decades. And today we would like to focus this conversation on how the future of educators could look like. Mm-hmm. So in your opinion, how has the teacher's role changed in the past decade?
Well, obviously, education and teaching, they don't operate in a vacuum. They are very much influenced by changes and trends in society. We would all agree that there have been substantial changes over especially the past few decades. And there are many factors that have contributed to those changes, but maybe I can focus on, one or two of those factors. The first is, I would say, there's probably more access to information today than at any other time in human history. And I would say more importantly, this is not limited to an initiated few, as was the case in the past, but it's available to the masses. And that's been obviously mainly due to technological advances such as the internet, etc. So, for example, when I was at school, back in the 70s, I would say the teacher was very much seen as the person who was there to transmit this knowledge to their students. And of course, we had books. Of course, we had libraries, and therefore people had access to that. We had encyclopedias, etc., etc. But again, in my opinion, it required a greater effort on the part of the learner to actively go and seek this. Whereas today, the information is just literally one click away. There's a lot of it. There's a huge amount of information out there, overwhelming in a sense. So the role of the educator is less about, the transmission of knowledge, which had been curated, but it's more about looking at the validity, for example, of the information that's out there, how to triage it, how to critically engage with it. We hear a lot today in education about, thinking critically. And that critical thinking that is valued today in society, at least in part, is a result of the fact that we are inundated with information. And if a person is unable to figure out what is valid, what is misinformation, what is disinformation, which is another huge challenge in today's society, then they will find it incredibly difficult to navigate the complexity of today's world. And obviously, when people read things, they are influenced by them, as one would expect. And that could lead to decisions, decisions leads to consequences, etc., etc.
Even before COVID, we were saying that the role of teachers was changing because of the technological advancements. And, instead of being the source of information, they should be more rather coaching or moderating the learners on how to get the information in the right way.
Yeah.
But then the COVID started, and I always say that it was the biggest upskilling exercise of our times, because the teachers literally from one day to another had to become digital literate and start using certain tools.
Well, I mean, whether we're asking too much, just enough, or too little, it's an academic question. Someone once said that necessity is the mother of invention. And in a sense, I think you're touching on an important point, which is the importance of adaptability that a teacher needs to have. I've always felt that is the single biggest quality that a teacher needs to possess, to be able to adapt to the changes that we are encountering.
At the same time, we see that education is one of the most conservative fields of our life.
Right, exactly.
So how do you cope with this conservative mood and the constant necessity to change?
If it's a question of coping, I would argue that we are coping. At times we are struggling, and the struggle is pretty obvious. And many educators, many colleagues would turn around and say, "Well, we're being asked an impossible task," and yet students are in classes, in schools. Students are being educated, and we are doing the best we can. As educators, I can tell you that some of the time, for some educators, a lot of the time, the level of discomfort is very high. But hopefully, what I'm hoping for, and I'm somebody who is optimistic, I would say that some things are going to come out of that. Learning is going to take place.
In fact, I think there were several reports coming out these months speaking about the shortages of teachers globally. We're speaking about hundreds of thousands of teachers missing. And of course, we discussed the difficulties of the profession, but what one advice would you give to someone who is considering to become a teacher or who is starting their teaching career right now?
Well, if somebody is choosing to become a teacher today, be clear about why you have chosen this profession, and make sure that the reason is compelling enough so that it can sustain you through the challenges that you are going to encounter. And the job involves many challenges, and it doesn't matter whether you are a primary or a secondary teacher or an early years teacher, or even university professors. Engaging in the world of education, teaching and learning as a process is challenging. Sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes the solutions, if there are clear-cut solutions, they're not obvious. So having a clear why, in terms of why I joined this profession, is a way of, I suppose, sustaining you. It acts as your North Star, in a sense. And you talked a little bit about COVID, and as far as I was concerned, COVID was a wonderful test of that, both in terms of the ability of teachers to adapt and the consequences of that, but also to continue doing what they were doing in the face of what was significant adversity, not just for teachers, obviously, but for societies and communities as a whole. But essentially, that North Star is so important. I mean, for me, that's very much how I operate. Yeah.
So I think we've said two things. First, have it clear the why you're becoming a teacher, and then you've mentioned the essential quality is being able to adapt,
right.
Being able to be flexible,
right.
because the profession is changing as we speak, right? These are the two.
The world is changing as we speak.
Yeah.
So and so we have to adapt with that. And the adaptation, by the way, just again, I think this is an important point. It's not just about always thinking, how can we do things differently? It's also having the discernment to say, well, some of the things that we were doing before are still valuable, and we need to fight to maintain it. Being able to figure out what we need to keep and what needs to change. How do we think about that for the future as well? I mean, people talk about in terms of future proofing, and there are many, many terms, like that. But essentially, is how do we adapt the form, but maintaining the essence of what we feel, these are the values that we need to embrace. Yeah.
You've mentioned already the technological advancement and the influence they have on teaching profession, but now I would like to go to a very boiling hot potato issue, which are social media. So recently, several countries like Norway or Australia have introduced the ban on using social media for kids under a certain age. What do you think about it? How do we balance the fact that, current generation has been born digital, and at the same time, devices time and social media can strongly impact their learning process?
Yeah, I mean, I've also been reading about this. I think many schools have made that decision. I mean, it's not done on a national scale, but certainly in
your school? Do you
no,
have that
no,
decision?
no. We don't have a ban on, and we kind of leave it to the teachers, because some teachers want the students to use the mobile phone as a tool in class. Yeah, for example.
Really?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And it's not a distraction. I'm surprised.
Here's my take on this, if that's what you're asking me. First and foremost, again, in my years as an educator, my reaction has always been, well, when has banning anything ever solved a problem, right? When has banning anything ever solved a problem? And you talked about Norway, for example, where even before the talk about, raising the minimum age to 15 in terms of the use of social media, well, before that, they had the minimum age as 13, right? And, the statistics from the Norwegian Media Authority were, even then, it showed that more than 50% of under 10s, 58% of 10-year-olds, and 72% of 11-year-olds were still using social media. So that was the age of 13. So frankly, I mean, the big question is, what chance do they have with 13 and 14-year-olds? I mean, it's and how do you police that? I fully understand that there is a genuine concern about the potential dangers of these virtual spaces and that digital sphere in a way. Banning cannot be the solution. It can't be the only solution. I know that almost, for certain. And whereas banning something seems on the surface to be an easy solution, or this is the easiest thing to do as opposed to an easy solution, it's not effective. Education is far more challenging, but when it works, it really works. So education is far better as an approach generally. And let me give you a very personal example, right? I have two children, and they are grown up now. And when they were born, my wife and I were very conscious about the possibility of, them spending a lot of time in front of the television. And so what we did was we said, okay, what are we going to do? We are going to try and restrict the, them sitting in front of the television and watching. But at the same time, we also need to be a bit more proactive in terms of, well, what kind of family activities can we do? What kind of other activities that we want to encourage them to engage with? Yeah, that basically give them, something else, a different experience from that of sitting and watching a screen. And one can sit and watch a screen for hours and hours. So in a sense, to turn around and say, no television, no social media, no anything, young people of any age will find very creative ideas to, bypass the bans.
Yeah, Khalid, what you said is super interesting. So ban, we know, never works. Restrictions do work. But one element that you've mentioned, which is I think is super important in your example, is that you have to suggest an alternative, a stimulating alternative to kids to what you're banning. And in that scenario, you put a lot of responsibility on the family. What about schools and education? Is there a certain part of responsibility to suggest that alternative to kids?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not even a question of suggestion. It's a question of creating. The role of a school is to create opportunities and spaces for young people to learn. And at the moment, when we think about schools, we tend to think about them almost in terms of a binary where you have curricular and co-curricular or extracurricular, where the curricula in many schools element is associated with the academic, and has at least a perceived higher value, yeah, than the others, even though I feel that's changing. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. But what if we begin to see the time that a student spends in school, not in terms of that binary, but in terms of a multiplicity of learning contexts? And so, how do we support young people as they engage with the different learning contexts? And so, for some learning contexts, that might involve the use of, technology, yeah, whether it's social media or anything else. And therefore, how do we support them? What does that mean? Instead of just saying, no, it's an all-out ban, or you're not allowed to use your phone at all in school, well, maybe they need to learn that in some contexts it's appropriate to use it, and in other contexts it's not appropriate to use it. And that's where I feel I go back to the idea of education. What does that actually mean? And we have to think about it ourselves as educators. And we also, and that is a responsibility, because what it requires us to do is it requires us also to upskill if we need it. I was born in 1968, and yet I teach today in 2024, almost 2025. But, in a sense, so much has changed over those decades. And yet, if I choose to remain, an educator, I have to also accept the responsibility that, falls on me to actually see how I can adapt and change, etc.
Dear listeners, stay tuned and remember to subscribe to the show on all platforms. Khalid, from the decades of experience you have, I will ask you now to do a blitz of questions about the skills that could be important for the future. So those skills that our listeners might need to develop further in order to stay relevant for the labor market. Would you mind giving me your score from 1 to 10, 1 being less important and 10 being extremely important? Okay? So let's start. Learning to learn.
10.
Critical thinking.
10.
Memorization, timetables, dates, figures.
8.
Oh, that's high, actually.
Yep.
So you do believe that we need to remember the timetable by heart, right?
I believe we have to continue to grow our memory capacity. I have no doubt about that, because that is fundamental to learning. And turning around and saying we no longer have to remember things is for me is a bizarre concept. I mean, I've heard it before, but growing our memory is, as far as I understand it, in terms of the neuroscience, is vital for the learning process.
It's incredible, because I think this is the question that provokes discussion on this podcast. And I think it's 50% people saying we don't have to develop, the memory in that way. Maybe we do it differently, and then 50% saying we do need.
I will tell you, I am genuinely concerned about the long-term effects of people not having to rely and work with memory, because it's not about relying on memory, because relying on memory, implies that it's static, whereas I see it as like a muscle, if you like, which has to be developed. So what does that mean in the long term? And I don't know, when we look at longitudinal studies, in terms of incidence of dementia or Alzheimer's, if we are no longer using our memory and developing our memory and keeping it active. I have no idea. I'm not a neuroscientist, so this is definitely an area that I'm not an expert in, but I am obviously, as an educator, aware of some neuroscience, because in today's world that knowledge is available. And I would argue that as an educator, I have a responsibility to educate myself about that. But I am genuinely, concerned about that. I mean, we just see it in the GPS, yeah, in cars. People no longer think about, how to get from A to B because they rely on the GPS. And anybody who's used a GPS knows that it can take them to places that, perhaps they don't want to go to, down interesting routes. Yeah. So in a way, I feel this over reliance on tools and saying, well, because these tools exist, we no longer have to develop our memory. I'm not comfortable with, that conclusion.
Okay, so 8, very important,
Yes,
memorization.
yes.
Foreign languages.
10. You're talking to a language teacher. I'm a French teacher and an English teacher. So, yes, foreign languages. But I mean, even beyond that, because obviously for me, foreign languages, when we talk about intercultural fluency, I would not be able to have a real sense of where I am in Italy if I made no effort to actually learn Italian, which is why all the students at the college must learn Italian. This is a condition of entry to the college. They have to learn when they're here Italian. So it's vital.
Empathy?
12.
Okay, so the big one, the top one, we have the winner, is the empathy. Why?
Well, I mean, again, the United World College movement is about peace building. And so, quite frankly, it's incredibly difficult to try and understand somebody else's perspective, reality, if you don't have empathy. I mean, at the college, we have Palestinian students and Israeli students. We have Russian students and Ukrainian students. How could they begin to talk to one another, work with one another? I mean, I've used those examples because they're the most obvious and they're the most relatable in terms of what's happening in the world today. Empathy is an important quality, trait. It's more than that, actually. It's something that can be nurtured. It's something that can be developed. And it's essential for people to live together and to understand one another, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a must. Yeah, it's not even an option.
Khalid, but how much of the responsibility it is on the family, actually? Because I do believe empathy should be developed since it's very early age,
Yeah,
maybe, since even before the education,
yeah.
and how much of it is on educational system.
Again, just for the record, I don't see education just in terms of schooling. Yeah, education. I mean, if we want to talk about schooling, then that's schooling. Education
Yeah.
is lifelong. So, in a sense, even before birth. And we talk about lifelong learning, as far as I know, therefore, it continues until we are no longer part of this physical world. So, in a sense, that for me is education. So, yes, education is required at all these phases to ensure that we continue to develop our empathy. Because again, it's not something that once you develop it, it's done, it's developed.
You stop. Yes.
Yeah, it's always a work in progress because we encounter, our civilization almost, sits on a house of cards. All you have to do is change the circumstances of any individual sufficiently for them to default to primal instincts. Yeah. And that's when civilization kind of collapses in a sense. Yeah? When we talk about civility and how we've come along so far, over the centuries and the millennia.
It's super interesting what you just said, that our societies look like they're built on a house of cards. So, and in fact, last 2-3 years were really difficult years in terms of changes. Another war happening on the European continent,
Yep.
a major
Yep.
war, another war between Palestine and Israel. And it's a difficult society to live in, right? So do you think you have more problems in motivating students to engage because of those house of cards that are falling?
Well, firstly, motivating students has been one of the primary goals of educators since, since the beginning. When I was at school, there were students in the class who were not interested in what the teacher was saying. Perhaps today the difference is there is more onus on a teacher to think about how they can motivate students. Whereas when I was at school, the teacher looked at the class, and those students who were motivated and willing to work, they were the ones that deserved the teacher's attention, and the others, well, they either were ignored or punished. Whereas today, at least in the education systems where I've worked, the the onus is very much on the teacher to think about ways of motivating students. And so, in a sense, I feel that that's fundamental. That's something that is part and parcel of the teaching and learning process. I need to perhaps stress also that, again, going back to the idea of learning contexts, if we choose to divide the educational experience or the school experience in terms of classroom and extracurriculars, and we go with that binary, then it creates problems in terms of motivation, because we all know that, some students enjoy some subjects more than others. We also know that some students enjoy some educational activities, it could be physical activities or whatever, over others. But if we start looking at the educational experience as a multiplicity of learning contexts, right, then it's important for a teacher to understand that a student's motivation will vary from one context to another. It means that if I have a student in my English class who's not motivated, I should not assume that that student is unmotivated across the board. I shouldn't turn around and think, well, this is somebody who should not be at school, right? Or because they could be incredibly motivated, incredibly passionate in other learning contexts. I think that part is very important for me. So maybe when we think about what motivates, what engages a student, I mean, there's something we call intrinsic motivation. And that could be that they have a passion or a love of something. Perhaps they have also certain abilities. I mean, many people, whether they are young or older, they tend to like the things that they feel they're good at. Therefore, they connect that emotion of liking or disliking something with how well they are performing in that. But there are other contexts where the motivation of the learner will be low. And that's when, as teachers, we have to start thinking about, well, what can be done. And so me personally, well, the way I look at it is, firstly, I think about it in terms of autonomy. I mean, what today in educational speak, we talk about learner agency. If they feel, if somebody who is learning, whether it's a young person or an adult, feels that they have some control over where this is going, the goals, etc., how it can be done, then they are more likely to engage with the process, because engagement is super important. Obviously, engagement and motivation, go hand in hand. That plays a huge role. So learner agency, I would say, is fundamental in terms of trying to motivate somebody who seems to have low motivation. The other thing is also competence. I talked a little bit about, if somebody feels that they have an innate talent, or an ability in something, and they perform well in it, they're going to get kind of positive feedback, and you have that feedback loop, which makes them want to do more of it. But if they don't have that natural ability, and they believe that they will never get it and they can never develop it, then they see this as a dead end, in a sense. What's the point? So the work of, which is, quite now well known, the work of Carol Dweck in terms of growth mindsets, etc., is fundamental. So how, as an educator, do I ensure that the learner understands that this is not a permanent state, that this is something that actually can be changed? And I have a role to play in that, in helping the learner.
It's nearly the coaching, the life coaching
Exactly.
function.
So it becomes more of a coaching role. Exactly. And then also, again, I mean, at the heart of education, teaching and learning process, however you want to look at it, is the idea of relationships. So relatedness. I would say both in terms of the relationship between the teacher and the student, and then obviously, because again, students tend to do a lot of work together, as groups, as pairs, whatever, then the relatedness, the relationship between student, and how do you help to ensure that, there's cohesion in that, and how do you help them, navigate some of the challenges is super important.
Thanks a lot, Khalid. Just one final remark. What a time to be alive and what a time to be an educator, right?
Absolutely.
One of the most challenging professions, changing continuously, and yet the one that has the bigger impact, I think, in our societies.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's transformational, both obviously for the learners and for the educators.
Thank you so much for your time. It was super interesting conversation.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciated it. And thanks for talking.
And thanks to all of you, our listeners, and stay tuned as there is much more to come. Goodbye.